From the Baker Institute for Public Policy at Rice University in Houston, Texas, this is Baker Briefing. I'm Ana Martin Gil, Research Manager of the Edward P. Djerejian Center for the Middle East. Today's topic, refugees and internally displaced people. More than 100 days into the Israel-Gaza war, 85% of Gazans, or 1.9 million people, are internally displaced. This crisis highlights the unique challenges refugees, asylum seekers, and internally displaced people face, including the lack of access to shelter, food, healthcare, and basic services. In fact, as of 2023, 108.4 million people have been forcibly displaced worldwide, encompassing 35.3 million refugees, 62.5 million internally displaced individuals, and 5.4 million asylum seekers. Moreover, around two-thirds of these people live in poverty. And as a result of regional conflicts, human rights violations, and persecution, the number of people being displaced continue to climb. According to the UN High Commissioner for Refugees, the three durable current solutions, which are the return, resettlement, and local integration of these groups, are unavailable or politically untenable for most displaced people. Today, we're going to talk about the factors that contribute to displacement. How has the international community traditionally responded? And how can policymakers address the challenges of displacement today? With me are my colleagues Kelsey Norman, the Director of the Women's Rights, Human Rights, and Refugees Program, and a Fellow for the Middle East at the Baker Institute, and Elizabeth Ferris, Non-Resident Fellow at the Baker Institute, and Director of the Institute for the Study of International Migration at Georgetown University. Kelsey and Beth, thank you for being here. Let's start with the basics. Kelsey, why has the number of refugees increased quite drastically over the last decade?
Thanks so much for having us, Anna. This is a great question, and often there's a lot of confusion around refugee and IDP and asylum seeker numbers. So the main accounting we look to is with the United Nations High Commissioner for Refugees, and the numbers are quite high for refugees at the moment. And often the UNHCR will portray its data as beginning in 2000 and kind of showing an upward trajectory since then. But I think it's important to remember that often refugees exist because they're having to flee violence, dangerous situations, and war. So at the moment, we're seeing responses to wars that began in the 2010s, including the displacement of Syrian refugees beginning in 2011 and ongoing today. More than 6 million individuals are still displaced. We've also seen displacement as a result of the situation in Venezuela. And also since 2022, Afghan displacement has been incredibly high, as well as the war in Ukraine. So we're seeing these global situations producing high numbers of refugees. But, back in the 1990s, these numbers were also quite high, not as high as they are today, but certainly quite high as a result of the end of the Cold War, the breakup of states, war in the Balkans. So this isn't something that's quite linear as it's often made out to be. And it's also important to remember that we can think about refugees as a percentage of the global population. So yes, the numbers of refugees consistently go up, but so does the world's population. So it's important to put it in the context of where we are today as compared to several decades ago, and to remember that this isn't linear. It's just that we're at a particular point where there's been numerous wars over the last decade that have made the refugee numbers quite high.
Beth, we often hear the terms that Kelsey just mentioned, refugee and internally displaced person. Can you explain what is the difference between these two groups and how do their needs differ?
Sure, and thank you very much for doing this and drawing attention to the situation of both refugees and IDPs, internally displaced persons. As you mentioned, Anna, the number of IDPs is much higher, almost twice as many IDPs in the world as refugees. And, these are people who flee often for exactly the same reasons as refugees, conflicts, armed violence, persecution, but can't, for various reasons, make it to an international border. Sometimes people want to stay closer to home. They think this is going to be temporary and they'll be able to go back soon. And so sometimes they prefer to stay there, or sometimes they can't move. People with disabilities or older people, for example, are much less likely to try to go to another country in search of protection. And frankly, as governments close their borders and make it harder and harder for people people to seek asylum in their countries. A lot of people are trapped. They can't get to another country to seek safety. And while, refugees have lots of needs, so do IDPs. IDPs get much less attention from the international community. They're often invisible. Kelsey just mentioned the 6 million Syrian refugees. Well, there are over 7 million Syrian IDPs who receive less international assistance. It's harder for international agencies to reach them. They're closer to the violence. On the other hand, they are citizens of their countries and, at least theoretically, should be able to enter the formal labor market and access social services the same as other citizens. In practice, it's often very difficult for IDPs to do that. Sometimes they're viewed with suspicion or stigma. And under international law, it's the responsibility of their governments to protect and assist them, even when, as in the case of Syria, the government is at least partially responsible for their displacement. So, to turn to the government that's dropping bombs in your part of the world to find the support you need is very difficult. So I'm glad you're drawing attention to IDPs. They deserve a lot more attention.
So going back to the topic of refugees, Kelsey, what are traditional approaches that have been used to assist refugees, and what does voluntary repatriation, local integration, and resettlement entail?
Great question. These are the three what are called durable solutions that are offered by or proclaimed by the UNHCR as being sort of the best case scenarios for refugees. So as Beth said, these are individuals who have been able to leave their countries and have ended up in some other country, usually a neighboring country that's close to their home country. So the UN typically views what's called voluntary repatriation as kind of the best case scenario, meaning after hopefully a conflict has ended, refugees can go back to their home because that is where they're from. That's where they still have connections. Ideally, that would be what happens. But in reality, many conflicts are protracted after a war has occurred. It doesn't mean the country is in a great situation. We can think of the Syrian crisis, the Syrian displacement crisis and civil war, and, current President Bashar al-Assad stayed in power. So for many people, voluntary repatriation is just not feasible or not considered safe. So it's not always an available option to everyone. Otherwise, there's local integration. So this would be an individual integrating economically, socially, otherwise into their host country. And this can be difficult for various reasons. So most refugees live in countries of the global south, more than 80% do. And these countries are less developed or sometimes least developed countries. So they're already contending with issues, including high unemployment, maybe unavailability of social services from the government. There might be resentment about refugee presence. So local integration is not always a viable option either. So what's called resettlement is seen as a third option, whereby an individual, let's say they end up in a country like Turkey or a country like Kenya, maybe going from those countries to usually a Western country, although not always. Sometimes countries in the global south resettle refugees too, but usually a Western country, a developed country, a rich country like the United States, whereby they could kind of start their life over there. This has also become politically increasingly difficult in the US context. And that's been especially true since 2016, when our refugee resettlement numbers kind of dropped off a cliff and haven't fully recovered since then, although there have been various efforts by the Biden administration to kind of bring those numbers back up. But regardless, resettlement is only actually available to less than 1% of the world's refugees. So it's also not a very, widely applicable option for refugees.
So Beth, we've spoken about approaches used in the past, and as Kelsey mentioned, they are becoming increasingly more difficult to implement. Can you elaborate on that a little more and explain why are the old approaches just not working anymore?
Well, first of all, conflicts are lasting longer. I think it's the failure of the UN Security Council or the international community generally to bring an end to conflicts. Some places like Democratic Republic of Congo and Yemen and Myanmar. Conflicts drag on, making returns more and more difficult for both refugees and for IDPs. And, governments that have hosted refugees for a long period of time are getting impatient. They look at the economic, the social, sometimes the political costs of hosting refugees for years and years. Kenya has had Somali refugees since the early 1990s. And, governments we talk about donor fatigue, but there's certainly host country fatigue. And particularly when we see that international funding is declining. There are too many humanitarian crises in the world right now. The money isn't enough to support all of these. And so perhaps it's logical for donor governments to choose to cut funds for some of these long-standing situations in order to respond to new crises, such as in Gaza or in Syria or in other places. I also want to draw attention to Sudan, that doesn't get nearly enough attention, where you've got 7 million people who've been displaced for the past year, and where funding for Sudan, the UN appeal, is funded as of yesterday at only 3%. 3% of the funds needed for 7 million people are not there. So, but with less support from the international community, host governments are deciding we can't keep these people forever. We've got to cut off assistance and really encourage them to find solutions. But if you can't go home and you can't settle in the countries where you are, and resettlement opportunities, as Kelsey mentioned, are never enough to go around. So you have more and more protracted displacement. These numbers that are often cited, 108 and even more millions now with the situation in Gaza. As these numbers increase, you have new displacements added on top of old displacements where, many refugees have been displaced for 5, 10, 15, 30 years. Case of the Palestinians for now 75 years. But, Somali refugees in Kenya, you've got 3 generations of refugees growing up in camps who've never been to Somalia or caught in this limbo for all of their lives. So protracted displacement deserves a lot more attention. Our media doesn't focus on these long-term displacement situations. It's much sexier to look at the newest crises and to put the newest figures up. But, let's not forget about those who've been displaced for a long, long time. And we really need some new approaches.
So Beth, what do you think could be more effective solutions? Is perhaps refugee self-reliance a viable solution to consider?
Yeah, the refugee self-reliance has been around for a while, but it's the idea that, well, if you can't find a permanent solution, if you can't go home, if you can't become a citizen, say, of the country and where you sought refuge, at least making refugees, supporting them to become self-reliant and not depend on international assistance. Refugees everywhere want to be self-reliant. Nobody likes receiving handouts or waiting for assistance. It's never enough. And so if refugees can become self-reliant, if they can support their families, if they can get their kids in school, if they can get the health care they need, they can live productive lives, even if they haven't found a solution. So, increasingly non-governmental organizations, the UN, are looking at ways to increase this self-reliance of both refugees and IDPs to, support them to start small businesses or to be able to enter the labor market in various capacities, recognizing that this is a way of ensuring dignity for refugees, reducing the financial burden on host governments, and oftentimes really benefiting private employers who can use refugees or IDPs in a country to fulfill needed labor shortages.
Let's talk about Palestinian refugees for a minute, since it's on many people's minds. Kelsey, in an article you published recently, you mentioned that Egypt is refusing to open its border to refugees from Gaza, apart from a select group of individuals. So why is Egypt reluctant to do so? What are some challenges host nations generally face when accepting large quantities of refugee populations?
Yeah, that's a great question. Thanks, Anna. So the situation since October 7th with the Hamas attacks in Israel and the constant bombardment of Gaza by Israeli forces has led to calls for Egypt to open its southern border between Gaza and Egypt to allow Palestinians from Gaza to enter Egyptian territory. And this has raised a lot of questions. I think the questions are slightly different for researchers, others who focus on the Middle East, than they are for individuals who focus on migration. So Egypt has objected to allowing Palestinians, aside from dual nationals, so Palestinians that hold other nationalities as well as that identity, and also critically injured individuals who generally can't stay in Egypt. They're just transported elsewhere for the most part. Egypt, I don't think at this point will accept large numbers of Palestinians because it would see that as being complicit in removing Palestinians from their territory with no real guarantee that they'll be able to go back to Gaza once this fighting concludes. And, this comes from a long history of seeing Palestinian displacement from what was Mandate Palestine, but also later in different iterations during the course of different wars, whereby Palestinians lost territory and weren't able to return to it. So there's a real history there and a real fear that this would result in the same situation. And Egypt does not want to be party to that process. There's also, though, political reasons behind it. So Egypt has hosted Palestinians historically throughout various decades after the 1948 initial displacement, as well as after various wars. At one point, Egypt controlled the Gaza Strip as well. So it's very tied to this conflict. And in recent decades, the issue of Hamas has been very politicized in Egypt because of its ideological ties to the Muslim Brotherhood in Egypt, which, for those who know this history, recall that after the Egyptian uprising, the Muslim Brotherhood sort of controlled the government with the election of Mohamed Morsi. And after he was deposed from power, there was this demonization of the Muslim Brotherhood and anything affiliated with it in Egypt, and that continues until today. So these ties to Hamas, or alleging fear of ties to Hamas, and thus to Palestinians living under Hamas, means that there's a real worry that there could be sort of any ideological infiltration, along with individuals who might not have any political leanings as such, but nonetheless, Egypt is very fearful of that. So at this point, there's, the political reasons, as well as the not wanting to be party to any further displacement, any further coerced movement of Palestinians away from their territory. So at this point, I don't see Egypt accepting more than just the sort of handful of critically injured individuals that it has so far. And I think it speaks to a broader issue of the politicization that can happen around refugee populations beyond just Egypt and beyond Palestinians. For example, Beth has brought up protracted displacement, and the protracted Syrian displacement continues to lead to politicization of refugees in host states like Turkey, for example. We saw with the elections last year. So Turkey continues to be the country hosting the largest number of refugees worldwide. And whilst there's different periods where refugees are less politicized, and in many ways, Syrian refugees in Turkey are very integrated into Turkish society, informally into the economy, et cetera, it can also, at certain heightened political moments, lead to, really dangerous situations for refugees, with threats of returning them all back to Syria, for example, if a different political party had come to power, and other situations whereby refugees are kind of left in this precarity. So there is, a fear, I think, from host countries or potential host countries, as the case of Egypt with Palestinians, that hosting refugees can affect domestic politics.
Let's return to the topic of IDPs. The UN Office for the Coordination of Humanitarian Affairs outlines 8 different tenets to help IDPs, including safety and security, access to livelihood and documentation, and restoration of land and property, to name a few. So, Beth, what do you believe is the most important factor to consider when working towards helping IDPs?
Well, in general, I think that working on self-reliance, livelihoods, enabling IDPs to support themselves is probably the most important, although security is usually the first and most important concern. In focus group discussions we did last year with tens of thousands of IDPs, and when we talked with them, what's holding you back from finding a solution? The overwhelming theme was A, security, and B, economic security. Those two seem to be most important. Some of the research we've done, shows some interesting and kind of surprising things. We found, for example, that when IDPs have stable housing, they're more likely to secure employment, to put their kids in school, to be able to access services. We hadn't realized how important having stable housing is, for example. So I think that that's something very concrete that governments and UN agencies and other aid providers can concentrate on. Let's beef up the shelter that IDPs are living in, replace some of those tents with something a little bit more secure and safe. So housing is really important in helping IDPs find solutions. And, Kelsey was talking about the situation in Gaza, and I'm reminded of how complicated these labels are. mean, these are Palestinian refugees who are now IDPs. So you can be an IDP even if you've already been displaced. And certainly we see in Gaza and far too many other situations this multiple displacements. Displacement is dynamic. People don't just move to one place and stay there for years. They may move within their country of refuge. They may go back and forth. A lot of Iraqi refugees, for example, would go home regularly to pick up pension payments or check on property or see sick relatives and then go back to where they felt safer. So displacement is dynamic. And a lot of our frameworks and assumptions are very binary. You're either displaced or you're not. Well, what about, people in El Salvador, for example? Some people were displaced 25 times within the borders of their country before they sought protection in the United States, making that dangerous journey north. So, I think we have to recognize the limitations of some of our frameworks and terminology. And I mean, for a lot of refugees, for example, they're said to have found a durable solution when they return to their country of origin. But nobody really follows up. Do they stay there? Are they safe there? Are they able to survive? What's happening with the hundreds of thousands of Afghans who are now returning from Pakistan? Are they becoming IDPs? We think a lot of returning refugees aren't able to go back to their communities of origin. So yes, they're back in their country, but they're not home. They're still displaced. They're internally displaced. So I think we have a lot of work to do to unpack some of the consequences of the dynamism of displacement and, maybe to move away from some of our binary tools that you're displaced or you're not and see this much more as a continuum, a process, which is harder, I think, for the general public and policymakers to deal with, but may more accurately reflect the realities that displaced people experience.
Any final thoughts or comments, Beth and Kelsey?
I guess picking up from Beth's points, I think one thing we can all do is remember that individuals, when we hear these numbers, 35 million refugees, 60 million displaced, these are individuals with lives, with families, with connections. No one wants to leave their home in the first place, right? That's the step you take when there are sort of no other options available. And maybe the first step you take is to look for a safe place, refuge somewhere else within your own country. And only when you feel even desperation there would you consider crossing an international border. So the individuals we see trying to cross at Eagle Pass in Texas in our state, Anna, or harboring near Rafah with the hope of crossing into Egypt to seek safety there, these are individuals who never wanted to leave their homes in the first place. And there are studies out there to show ways of more positive reception of refugees, of displaced peoples. There are policies we know work to alleviate any kind of tensions that might exist in a host community. I think we can talk about this in a much more positive light than it often is framed in media representations and in political discussions.
Yeah, and I would just add, building off of Kelsey's comments, that we often see refugees and displaced persons as victims, and they are, but they're also survivors. I remember a few years ago, Australia ran a national campaign called Refugees Are Heroes. These are the people who've managed to escape dangerous situations, oftentimes bringing their families through incredibly difficult situations. Refugees and IDPs have agency. They're taking the initiative. They're struggling. I remember years ago working on Haitian refugees talking with a business entrepreneur who said, we need more people like this. We need more people with the skills and the courage and the creativity to brave those dangerous journeys and make it those would make great entrepreneurs in the U.S. economy. We need these people. So I think we need to look at refugees in terms of what they've experienced, but also just the tremendous contributions they can make and they have made to the United States.
Thank you so much, Beth and Kelsey, for your insights and for joining us today.
Thank you.
Today's episode was produced by the Baker Institute for Public Policy, which provides meaningful policy analysis on the most critical challenges facing Texas, the U.S., and the world. Baker Briefing is produced by Victoria Jepp and Shannon Moriarty. AV production is led by Kevin Young. This episode's production was led by Maria Morcas. Visit us at bakerinstitute.org to learn more. Thank you for listening.